It was supposed to be a night of celebration, but for Mark Davis, it would mark the beginning of the end. He stood there, watching his wife, Jennifer, surrounded by her family at the Christmas party, laughing, enjoying the festive cheer, completely unaware of the storm brewing just under the surface. The room was filled with the sound of holiday music and the clinking of glasses, but for Mark, it was as if time had slowed down, and every laugh echoed in his chest like a hammer. The moment he had dreaded for months had finally arrived. Jennifer, the woman he had loved for over a decade, had just handed him the divorce papers. "Just sign it, Mark," she had said, her voice cold, the words cutting through the noise of the party like a knife. He had hoped for a miracle, for something to change, but deep down, he knew the truth. Jennifer had already made up her mind. She had moved on, and now, she was asking him to let go. And there, in front of her entire family, he was about to sign the papers that would end their marriage. Mark felt the tears welling up, but he refused to let them fall. Not in front of them. Not in front of her. He could feel his hands trembling as he reached for the pen, his mind racing, a whirlwind of thoughts, anger, and heartbreak. The family continued to laugh, unaware of the deep pain Mark was feeling. To them, it was just another party, another Christmas celebration. But to Mark, this was the moment his life had been shattered. He took a deep breath, steadying his hands, and signed the papers. The room went silent for a moment, the weight of his action finally hitting him. Jennifer didn't notice. Her attention was on her family, on the Christmas tree, on the holiday cheer. To her, this was just another step in her plan, her escape from a life she no longer wanted. But Mark knew something she didn't. He wasn't done yet. This was just the beginning. He had already begun preparing. The man who had been humiliated in front of her family was about to rise again, and when he did, Jennifer would realize she had made the biggest mistake of her life. Mark sat in his car, the engine idling in the driveway, his hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles were white. The night felt colder than it ever had before, as if the universe itself was pressing down on him. He had just signed those papers, and now his world was falling apart. He tried to steady his breathing, but it was hard to ignore the crushing weight of everything that had happened. A year ago, his life was filled with laughter, shared memories, and the hope that he and Jennifer could make it through anything. But now, as he stared out at the house where they'd spent so many years building a life, everything felt hollow. He had loved her with everything he had, and yet, in a single moment, she had taken it all away. The thought of how easily she had handed him those papers made his stomach turn. She hadn't even seemed to care. There was no apology, no regret, just cold indifference. He remembered how her eyes had barely met his as she stood there, surrounded by her family, pretending everything was fine. The laughter, the clinking of glasses, it all felt like a cruel mockery of the life they had shared. Mark wanted to scream, to throw something, to break something. But all he could do was sit there, in the silence of his car, trying to make sense of what had just happened. How had they gone from being partners to this? From a team to strangers in a room full of people who didn't even notice the pain that was tearing him apart? He didn't know the answers, but one thing was clear: Jennifer had made her choice. And now, it was his turn to make his. He didn't know what the next steps would be, but he knew he couldn't just sit there and let her get away with it. He wasn't going to be the man she discarded and forgot. He was better than that. He would rise from this. The car started moving, pulling away from the driveway and down the street. As the house disappeared in the rearview mirror, Mark's mind started to clear. The tears had stopped. He wasn't going to cry anymore. He had a plan that Jennifer would never see coming. She thought he was weak, thought he was done, but she didn't know Mark Davis. He wasn't some man who would crawl into a hole and fade away. He was going to show her just how wrong she was. A silent storm was building, one that would sweep through everything she had worked for. He knew he wasn't alone in this fight. There were people he could trust, people who knew the law, knew how to navigate the mess that Jennifer had created. But even more than that, Mark had his own strength. He had his quiet resolve. He had patience, and patience was going to be his weapon. He wasn't going to lash out in anger. No, he would build something even more powerful, something Jennifer would never see coming. He drove for hours, the road stretching ahead of him like the future. He didn't know exactly what he would do, but he knew this. He was going to fight for what was his, for his family, for the life he had worked so hard to build. Jennifer thought she had everything figured out, But Mark was about to turn the tables. When he returned to that house, it would be on his terms. Jennifer would realize too late that she had underestimated him. Mark wasn't going to let her destroy everything they had. He was going to make her regret ever thinking she could walk away. Mark spent the next few weeks quietly going through everything he had left. His life had been reduced to a set of empty drawers and quiet rooms. His once comfortable home now felt like a place of haunting memories, each corner a reminder of the love he had lost. He knew he had to move fast. Jennifer had already made her decision, but Mark wasn't ready to accept it. Not like this. He had worked too hard for everything they had built, and he wasn't about to let her take it without a fight. Late one night, after hours of searching through his files, Mark found what he was looking for. He smiled to himself. It wasn't much, just a few papers, a couple of hidden contracts, but it was enough. Enough to turn the tide in his favor. Jennifer had always assumed that he was the quiet one, the one who never pushed back. She thought she could push him aside, and he would just fade into the background. But she didn't know Mark. Not really. As the days went by, Mark made his preparations. He hired a lawyer, someone who understood the kind of battle he was about to face. The divorce papers had been signed, but there was still the matter of the assets, the house, the business. Jennifer had thought she could take it all, but she was wrong. Mark wasn't going down without a fight. He wasn't about to let her walk away with everything, pretending like she hadn't torn their lives apart. He began gathering evidence. All the little things Jennifer had overlooked. He knew her well, knew her habits, and he used that to his advantage. While Jennifer was out at work, Mark spent his days quietly making moves. He wasn't in a rush, though. Patience had always been his strength. He didn't need to act impulsively. He was methodical, careful, and in control. As the weeks turned into months, Mark's confidence grew. He knew he was winning. Jennifer, meanwhile, was still focused on her own life. She didn't think Mark would fight back, but that was exactly what he was doing. He was making his move, and it was all happening under her nose. One evening, as the sun began to set, Mark looked out the window of their home one last time. This was it, the final stage of his plan. He wasn't the man Jennifer thought he was. He was something else. And when she found out, it would be too late to turn back. Mark spent weeks working in silence, watching Jennifer live her life, completely unaware of the storm that was slowly building. Each day felt like a game of chess, each move carefully calculated. He knew the divorce was inevitable, but he wasn't going to let it be the end. No, this was just the beginning of his new chapter, and he wasn't going to let her destroy everything they had without consequences. He had already made his first move. The lawyer he hired was smart, sharp, and exactly what he needed. They started gathering the necessary documents, the proof of ownership, the financial records, everything that would show Jennifer's true intentions. Mark wasn't just fighting for the house or the business. He was fighting for his dignity, for everything he had worked for. He wasn't going to let her walk away with all the spoils, pretending she had done nothing wrong. Jennifer, on the other hand, was busy with her own life. She had convinced herself that she had already won. After all, she had forced him to sign the papers in front of her family, humiliated him in the process, and walked away without a second thought. She didn't expect him to come back, not like this. She thought he would just fade away into the background, as he always had. But she had underestimated him. Jennifer continued to live her life as if nothing had changed. She was still the center of attention at her work, still getting attention from everyone around her. Mark's absence was hardly noticed. But as the days turned into weeks, things began to shift. Jennifer's facade started to crack. Mark's quiet actions, his careful planning, were starting to take shape. The first blow came when he contacted her lawyer. Jennifer thought everything was proceeding as planned, but little did she know, Mark was playing a game that would leave her in the dust. When the day came to meet with the lawyer, Mark walked into the office with a calm confidence. His lawyer had already set everything in motion. The terms of the divorce were about to change, and Mark wasn't going to let Jennifer take everything. He had already made his preparations, and now it was time to strike. The meeting was tense, the air thick with anticipation. Jennifer's lawyer looked at the documents Mark's team had prepared. There was no denying the evidence. It was clear that Jennifer had made a huge mistake. As the lawyer read through the documents, Mark could see the disbelief on his face. He was prepared for this. He had known it was coming, but seeing it unfold was something else. Jennifer's lawyer tried to remain calm, but the shock was evident. It was clear that Mark had the upper hand now. The balance of power had shifted. Jennifer was no longer in control. Mark's plan was working. He had done it all without making a scene, without raising his voice. He had quietly built his case, and now it was time for Jennifer to face the consequences of her actions. The lawyer looked up from the papers, his expression serious. "You're in a strong position," he said. "But you have to be prepared. This will get messy." Mark nodded, his face set in determination. He had already anticipated the mess. It didn't matter. He was ready. Jennifer had thought she could take everything from him, but she had underestimated just how far he would go. Now, it was Mark's turn to take back control, to remind Jennifer just who she was dealing with. The fight was far from over, but Mark knew he was on the winning side. This was the beginning of his comeback. Mark sat in his car, staring at the reflection of the house in his rearview mirror. He had made it this far. The documents, the evidence, everything was ready. It was time to push forward. The last few weeks had been a blur of meetings with his lawyer, hours spent combing through his finances, and carefully documenting every detail of Jennifer's betrayal. Mark hadn't spoken to Jennifer since that night at the Christmas party, and in a way, that had been the hardest part. Not the divorce, not the humiliation, but the silence. He had been married to her for so long, and now, it felt like they were strangers. He never imagined it would come to this. Jennifer had always been the one who talked, the one who made the decisions, the one who controlled the narrative. But now it was his turn. He had learned the hard way that silence could be more powerful than words. As he drove to the courthouse, Mark thought back to the days when things were different. The days when he and Jennifer had plans, dreams, a future together. They had built their life from scratch, starting with nothing but hard work and determination. Mark had always believed that hard work was enough, that love was enough, but he had been wrong. Love wasn't enough when it was one-sided. He had given everything to this marriage, and now, Jennifer was walking away with nothing but the illusion of victory. Mark wasn't going to let her have the last word. The papers were ready. The lawyer was ready. He was ready. The fight was no longer just about property or money. It was about principle. He had to show Jennifer that her actions had consequences. As he parked outside the courthouse, Mark took a deep breath, steadying himself for what was coming next. He knew this wouldn't be easy. He knew that Jennifer would fight back, that her lawyer would do everything to make sure she didn't lose. But Mark wasn't intimidated. He had spent too many years being pushed around, being the quiet one, being the one who always took the back seat. Not anymore. This time, he was going to fight for what he deserved. Walking into the courthouse, Mark could feel the weight of the moment. The air was heavy, the silence almost suffocating. He knew Jennifer would be here soon, sitting across from him, pretending that she was the victim in all of this. But Mark wasn't going to let her play that role anymore. This was his turn to speak, his turn to tell the truth. He sat down in the courtroom, his heart pounding in his chest. The judge entered, and the room quieted. This was it. Jennifer walked in moments later, her usual confident stride replaced with a tight-lipped expression. Mark didn't look at her right away. He didn't need to. He knew the truth, and he wasn't going to let her manipulate the situation any longer. The lawyer presented the evidence Mark had carefully prepared, and as the documents were read aloud, Jennifer's face changed. Her confident exterior began to crack, and for the first time since this whole ordeal began, she looked uncertain. Mark didn't smile. He didn't gloat. He simply sat there, watching as Jennifer realized that her world was crumbling. The divorce wasn't just about the end of their marriage. It was about accountability. Mark had given everything to this relationship, and now he was taking back control. The judge looked over the documents, and after a few moments, nodded. Mark had won. Jennifer's face turned pale, her lips trembling as she realized there was no way out. Mark stood up, his body filled with a quiet strength. He wasn't angry anymore. He wasn't sad. He was just done. As he left the courthouse, Mark felt a sense of calm wash over him. The battle was over, and he had won. But more importantly, he had found his voice. He had taken back control of his life. Jennifer had thought she could tear him down, but she had underestimated him. And now, as he walked away from the courthouse, Mark knew that this was just the beginning of his new life. Mark stood outside the courthouse, feeling the weight of everything that had happened. The crisp autumn air bit at his skin, but he didn't feel cold. For the first time in a long while, he felt like he was breathing again. The court ruling had been a victory, but it wasn't the end. It was just the beginning of the life he had been putting off for far too long. As he walked back to his car, Mark couldn't help but think about how much had changed in the past few months. The man who had walked into that courtroom was a different person from the one who had sat quietly at that Christmas party, signing divorce papers without a word. Now, Mark was someone who had taken back control, someone who had learned to fight for himself, for his future. He had always thought he needed Jennifer, that he couldn't survive without her. But now he knew better. He had built his life around her, but that life had never truly been his. He had spent so many years living for someone else, constantly trying to please her, to make her happy, never once considering what he wanted, what he needed. But that was over. Mark had finally realized that he was enough. He didn't need anyone to define him, especially not Jennifer. As he drove home, Mark's thoughts turned to the future. He had no idea what it would look like, but he knew one thing. It would be his to shape. He didn't need to be a victim anymore. He didn't need to let the past control him. The past had taught him valuable lessons, but now it was time to move forward, to start over. He wasn't going to rush into anything, though. He was in no hurry. This time, Mark was going to take his time, focus on himself, and do the things he had always wanted to do. He had spent too many years living for others, but now it was his turn. As he pulled into his driveway, Mark saw the house he had once shared with Jennifer. It no longer felt like home, but it didn't matter. He was ready to leave it behind. Mark stepped out of the car, the evening sky turning a deep shade of purple. He took a moment to look around, appreciating the silence. The silence was comforting now. It wasn't loneliness, it was peace. For the first time in a long time, Mark felt free. He wasn't sure what the future held, but for the first time in years, he was excited about it. The uncertainty didn't scare him anymore. He had faced his fears, faced his past, and come out stronger on the other side. He had won, not just in court, but in life. And as he walked toward the door, Mark smiled to himself. He had finally found his way. Mark's life had started to settle into a new rhythm, one he was still getting used to. Every morning, he woke up in the same house that had once felt like a prison, but now, there was a sense of freedom in the air. No more pretending, no more walking on eggshells. It was his space, his time, and he could finally breathe. He had spent years of his life building a future with someone who never truly saw him. But now, everything was his to define. He'd always told himself that he would never be the kind of person to let a relationship break him. But Jennifer had pushed him to the brink. Now, as he went through his daily routine, Mark found that he was finally reclaiming parts of himself that he had long neglected. He began working out again, not because he had to, but because he wanted to. He started running every morning, the rhythm of his feet on the pavement giving him a sense of peace he had never known before. His muscles ached in ways they hadn't in years, but it felt good. Mark felt alive. It was a small victory, but to him, it was everything. He wasn't just surviving anymore. He was living. One day, as he was walking through the park after his run, he bumped into an old friend from his college days, someone he hadn't seen in years. Sarah was standing by the fountain, reading a book. Her face lit up when she saw him. "Mark, I didn't expect to see you here," she said, her voice warm and genuine. It had been so long since Mark had had a conversation like this. They talked for hours, reminiscing about the past, talking about the present, and catching up on the things that had changed in their lives. Sarah was single now too, and her laughter filled the air in a way that made Mark feel lighter. For the first time in a long time, he didn't feel like he was carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders. They exchanged numbers before parting ways, and Mark felt a strange sense of hope. It wasn't about jumping into a new relationship. It wasn't even about what the future held. It was about the fact that he was open to it, open to life again. That was something he hadn't felt in a long time. As weeks went by, Mark continued to rebuild himself. He focused on his career, something he had put on the back burner for years while he tried to keep his marriage intact. His work started to pick up again, and he found himself feeling excited about the projects he was involved in. He had put his passion for work aside for so long, but now, it was back. He had a new sense of purpose, a drive that he had never felt before. There were moments when he thought about Jennifer, but those moments were becoming fewer and farther between. The anger and bitterness had started to fade. He had learned to forgive, not for her, but for himself. He realized that holding on to that pain would only keep him tied to the past, and he didn't want to live in the past anymore. He wanted to move forward. A month later, Mark met Sarah again for coffee. It was a casual meeting, just two old friends catching up, but it felt different. There was a connection there, something he hadn't felt in a long time. As they talked about life, Mark realized that he wasn't rushing into anything. He wasn't looking for love, but he was open to it. And that was a big step for him. It was a sign that he had truly healed, that he had moved on. Mark had come a long way from the man who had been broken by his divorce. Now, he was stronger, wiser, and more confident in himself than he had ever been. He had learned to take control of his life again, to embrace the future, and to let go of the past. For the first time in years, Mark felt truly free. It had been almost 6 months since the divorce was finalized, and Mark felt like a completely different person. He had rebuilt his life in ways he never imagined, taking each day as it came and finding joy in the simplest of things. The mornings were his favorite now. Waking up early, running through the park, feeling the cool morning air fill his lungs, and watching the sun rise was the kind of peace he had never known before. For years, he had lived under the shadow of his relationship with Jennifer, trying to keep up with her ever-changing expectations, trying to make her happy while losing sight of his own happiness. But now he had clarity. He had rediscovered the person he used to be before he got lost in the chaos of marriage. He wasn't perfect, and he wasn't pretending to be, but he was content. Mark had also grown closer to his friends, reconnecting with people who had faded into the background during his marriage. They had always been there for him, but he had been too focused on his marriage to really notice. Now, his phone was filled with text messages and calls from people who cared about him, who appreciated him for who he was. That meant more to him than anything else. The hardest part was over. He had survived the worst of it, and now he was ready to move forward. But just as Mark was starting to feel like everything was falling into place, life had one more curveball to throw his way. One afternoon, as he was sitting at a coffee shop, he saw her. Jennifer. She was sitting across the room, her eyes scanning through a magazine, completely unaware of Mark's presence. For a moment, time seemed to freeze. Mark didn't feel angry, didn't feel the bitterness that used to come with the thought of her. No, he just felt nothing. The pain, the hurt, it had all faded into the past. Jennifer was still beautiful, still poised, still the woman he had once loved. But now, looking at her from a distance, he realized something. He wasn't the man who needed her anymore. He wasn't the man who depended on her for validation. He had built something stronger within himself, something she couldn't take away. He had his life back, and that was more than enough. Jennifer glanced up, meeting his eyes for just a second. She looked startled, like she hadn't expected to see him. Mark smiled softly but didn't approach her. He didn't need to. He had already won. As he sat there, sipping his coffee, he thought about how far he had come. He had weathered the storm, rebuilt his life, and learned that his happiness didn't depend on anyone but himself. Life wasn't perfect, and there would still be challenges ahead, but Mark felt confident now. He wasn't going to let anyone define his worth. As he left the coffee shop, Mark walked out into the sunlight with a sense of purpose. He had learned that the only person he needed to impress was himself. The past was gone, and with it, all the regrets. He had learned to forgive, not just Jennifer, but himself too. And that was the greatest gift he could have ever given himself. The future was wide open, full of possibilities. Mark was ready to embrace it. Mark woke up the next morning to the sound of birds singing outside his window. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting a warm golden light across his bedroom. It was a peaceful morning, and for the first time in a long while, Mark felt truly at peace. He stretched and got out of bed, ready to face the day with a sense of purpose he hadn't known in years. His life had taken a turn he never expected, but in many ways, it had been for the better. As he made his morning coffee, Mark looked out the window at the quiet street. The world seemed calm, the weight of the past no longer hanging over him. He had taken control of his life, and it was a feeling he had never fully appreciated until now. The struggle, the pain, the heartbreak, he had turned it all into something powerful. Mark had learned that it wasn't about revenge or anger, but about reclaiming his own worth. He wasn't defined by his past mistakes or by anyone else's actions. He had learned to stand on his own 2 feet, and that was all that mattered. As the days went by, Mark continued to focus on his own growth. He spent more time with his friends, rekindling old connections, and exploring new opportunities in his career. He had learned to be more present in his life, to enjoy the little moments, and take pride in the person he had become. The weight that once burdened him had lifted, replaced by a sense of freedom and excitement for the future. One afternoon, as he sat at his desk working on a project, Mark received a call from Sarah. It had been a few weeks since they last met, and the conversation was light and easy, just two friends catching up. But as they talked, Mark couldn't help but feel a growing connection. Sarah had always been kind, understanding, and patient, and for the first time in a long time, Mark felt like he was opening up to someone again. He wasn't in a rush, and he wasn't looking for anything specific, but there was something comforting about the idea of sharing his life with someone who truly saw him. That night, after their conversation, Mark thought about how far he had come. He wasn't the man who had once clung to a broken relationship, desperately trying to make things work. He was stronger now, more confident in who he was, and ready to embrace the next chapter of his life. For the first time in years, Mark felt like he had the power to shape his own future. It wasn't about proving anything to anyone else. It was about proving to himself that he could overcome anything. He wasn't afraid of the unknown anymore. In fact, he was excited for it. As Mark sat on the porch, watching the sun set over the horizon, he couldn't help but smile. The journey hadn't been easy, but it had been worth it. He had fought for his freedom, for his peace, and for his happiness. And now, for the first time in a long time, he could truly say that he was happy. The past was behind him, and the future was full of endless possibilities.